We're going to be talking about a couple of things today. Feel free to heckle me, shout, don't throw things, and please keep the language relatively safe for everyone in the room. I want to start with why you're here. You all do security, and I kind of want to ask why you're testing security. Because there are lots of folks who are like, yeah, I do security, and I've done this. I've been in the security field for about 25 years. So a lot of my work has been in operations-focused stuff, technology, talking to management, being like, we have to add this new thing. We need another machine. And the thing is, I've come to the conclusion that there are only about 3 reasons that anyone tests security. One of them is absolutely terrible. The other 2 are kind of combined. First one is you want to improve. That's why most people do this stuff. The second one is you want to ensure everything's working. It's QA, right? The third one is horrible. It's that someone told you you had to. We're starting here for a reason. And it's because we have a problem. There's a problem with security testing in general. I think red teaming is great. I think pen tests are great. I think software QA is also super useful, and I think all of those fall into a category for me as someone who's done most of them, where we're going to be talking to someone who sometimes says, yeah, but we can't afford that, we don't want to do that, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of testing is carried out in that third last terrible category, and I think that's actually part of the problem. Testing's expensive. Fixing things is hard. Computers are hard. Give yourselves all a pat on the back because you do hard things every day. And it's hard to cover everything. We can't expect that everybody knows everything. I think Ian talked about the trivial part. I don't think there's any part of security that's actually trivial if you haven't done it before. And I certainly think that there are parts for everyone in this room that are not trivial because they haven't done them before. So when we talk about testing and we talk about red teaming specifically, there are lots of folks who got into this. I got into this industry because I wanted to be a red teamer. I think there are lots of folks who did because they were like, this is exciting. I get to do cool stuff. If you're of my generation, you saw Hackers, and when Angelina Jolie didn't show up on your first job, you got a little upset, but and it goes on. The thing with it is that red teaming is useful, but it covers only certain bases. Pen testing, same thing. QA, same thing. I'm not about to sell you snake oil about covering all the bases here, but I want to point out that there are other things that you can do here. And there's another piece. How many people in this room work on a SOC team or are defenders? I want to see hands. Really? That many? Okay, that's good to see. How many of you spend a lot of time working with red teams? Do you actually get to see what the red teams are doing in real time? Okay, that's a much smaller group of hands. What I think is kind of interesting is a lot of the testing that we're doing is carried out in a way where we're working with black boxes. Black box testing is great. It is really useful for finding things that you weren't expecting, but it's also kind of tricky. Because as a defender, you're not always seeing how the fake bad guy in this case got in, what they did, and what the process was. That means your responses aren't necessarily going to be what you'd expect. So I spent a chunk of my time working at CrowdStrike with the incident response team. We handle a lot of cases every day. Most of them are criminal in nature. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes with those. There's a lot that happens on the spot. We get to see the attack paths of each one of these threat actors again and again. That's part of the reason we've built profiles for them. Those attack paths don't vary too much, but as individual SOC operators or defenders or network defenders in the roles you're in, you're not necessarily going to see that guy more than once. You're going to see them once. It's going to be really bad. And the why comes back to this. You want your defenses to be good when you get in there. So let's do a quick level set before we kind of get any further. I'm talking about something that's called proactive security here. There are lots of ways to be proactive. I don't like the word proactive because I don't think it's a real word, but don't get me started on that. We can talk about that over beers you're buying. And let's just sort of back up here and say, okay, there are lots of ways to be proactive. Those include things like audit. Those include things like governance. Those include assessments. They also include testing. Testing is a proactive, it is an active discipline. You are always looking for something new. And the truth is a moving target. If you found something that worked last time, it might not work this time. And that's kind of the goal of this, which means a lot of times it's got to be continuous. How many of you have worked with continuous threat programs, with continuous red teaming? I thought so. I have run across, and I've worked with probably about 300 or 400 different companies at this point. I've run across 4 that are doing that. They're extremely advanced. They have large budgets for this. Most people don't. So you test. You do individual unit tests. You kind of work your way through the security program. There are some things on the red side of this slide that are actually really helpful for pretty much everybody, the exercises, the tests. The rest of Proactive, I've done all of this. I'm sure some of you have as well. These are all services that consulting companies offer, including mine. But that exercise piece actually is probably the most value anyone can get out of a testing process. And bear with me, I am getting into the purple part. There are a couple of things on this slide here. Obviously, we've got tabletop exercises. We just ran one a little earlier today. It was a lot of fun. If you haven't done a tabletop exercise, I would encourage you to actually look at some of the documentation around these. They're great. We have technical stuff. We have red, blue, and adversary and targets, target emulation and target testing. Targeted testing is really useful, again, because it's kind of like that QA piece. What we don't really see, though, is what the educational benefits for defenders are from a lot of this stuff. This is still, let's fix it. This is not necessarily, let's improve it. Part of the point behind a proactive program is you want to improve your overall security posture. I don't think anyone wants to come in and say, yeah, we did the same thing we did yesterday, and it's still working and everything's fine. Like, none of us do that. We're not in this profession for that reason, I don't think. Maybe I'm making a blanket statement. The other piece for the governance folks, reduce risks, improve processes, but mostly reduce risks. This comes down to a bottom line, but I'm focusing on the testing part, so let's go back to that. In the giant sort of framework of testing, we've got a bunch of different things we can do. On the one side of this chart, you've got tabletop exercises. I like them. You're going to hear me say tabletop exercise about 100 times today. I apologize. You can't yell drink because that's not the other conference that does that, but feel free to think it in your head. The other side's red teaming. Red teaming is great. We've just talked about how great it is. Okay, both of those, one's kind of easy. The other one's kind of hard. One's going to take a lot of time and effort to build out the exercise. You got to get all the right people in the room. The other one is going to take a lot of time and effort to actually build out the activity. You got to get the right people in the room. And it's usually effective in a sort of blind testing sense. The middle piece is actually where I want to focus for the rest of this talk. And the reason for it is pretty simple. There is not a lot that you can do that's going to be as effective as this in terms of testing for everybody involved if you do it right. The thing is that I've seen a lot of purple team exercises that were kind of like, well, we tried. So I guess this brings me to the next question, how? How are you testing this? For a lot of organizations I've worked with, what I've seen is, annually. That's the answer I get. Annually, we put some budget to it. Okay, great. I usually get similar explanations for why. Things like cost, impact, value. We can't do it too often. Red teams are hard to schedule. Defenders are hard to get in a room because they're too busy dealing with incidents. So I think part of the thing that's actually tricky with this is when you ask the governance folks or the risk people in the room about the how, they're going to have a list of things that they want. They've got their punch list. This goes back to my awful third category for a second. When I ask how you're testing security, some of you in the room, and I can kind of guess who, will tell me, oh yeah, we run these tests, we do these things this way, we've got this whole pile of stuff. There's kind of a disconnect that goes on in the way we approach testing, because when I talk to executives about it, they just want to know that it got done and what the results were. But that doesn't really tell the whole story. That's not talking about how, for example, if the gentleman in the hat over here, who was in my last session, so I'm picking on him, discovers a vulnerability because he's basically been running a red team exercise against one of the mainframes, and can explain that to management. It doesn't talk about how that's going to get up to leadership. It doesn't talk about how that's going to get changed. There's other processes for this, right? It feeds into all sorts of other pieces that could be super great and useful if we were actually doing them, but I want a show of hands. How many people are in a SOC team that is over 5 people? That's what I thought. You I'm not counting. The reason I'm asking this is because if the SOC team of over 5 people and the red team are working together, maybe you're going to get somewhere, but how big is your company? If it's 25 people, you might put this on a back burner. There might be other issues. So here's the snake oil bit, and I promise I'll stop preaching in a second. What if you could combine this with the testing, the defense, the rest of your leadership getting involved? Take a week, have a good time. I'm not saying that this is a solution for everything, but I think in a lot of cases, purple teaming exercises are actually really helpful for this, because you can go as far as actually saying, all right, let's simulate an incident, let's escalate, let's maybe, I don't know, blow up the factory, but not. And I think the thing about this for a lot of people who haven't approached it before, and if you have, good, you may have different, I want to talk to you about your opinions afterwards. The thing with this from our perspective is the repeatability, the science part of the test is incredibly useful because it's structured. We know we can do it again. We can shift how we're doing it. But then the other piece is the scalability and the fact that we can actually kind of say, hey, you know what, we're getting everybody in a room. You're all sitting around the table talking. If some of you from the other session will probably hear a couple of repeat themes here, feel free to drink. So my point really simply, combined testing helps train defenders, it improves security. There are two things on this slide. I'm sure all of you can think of other things. I keep looking at you and maybe you can. But yeah, you can probably think of other things that are beneficial for having your red and blue teams in the same room talking to each other, even if the red team's working in their own closed cell. My thing is the vulnerability management side, because that prior experience is part of where I come from. Red teamers use a lot of attack paths. They're going to repeat their attack paths. I know enough red teamers to know this is kind of how this works. It changes based on targets, etc. But from a generalized attack path, something like MITRE, you can kind of work out, okay, we got through all the basic incident stuff, and now we're going to get to the things that we're actually shifting, So yeah, you're changing up your tests, but you're not changing the basic building blocks of incident response there. You still have a thing that started, a thing you've got to deal with, a thing you've got to fix, and some other problems down the line that maybe you're not dealing with. The other side of this, though, is that you're also talking about vulnerabilities. How many people have dealt with a vulnerability that scaled up into an incident? I promise that's the only joke I'm going to make about that today. But if you work for SolarWinds, I apologize. That all joking aside, like I have worked with a dozen different companies where their first incident was actually just a major vulnerability they detected, and then 5 minutes later they're finding out it's being exploited. That's a problem. You don't want that. So lower bracket, vulnerability management, super useful. The other side is defenders. So this is the folks that raise their hand on the SOC team and anyone on incident response. How many of you have dealt with a major incident? Same folks, please put your hands back up if you dealt with a major incident. Okay, it's a small group. You don't count. Major incidents are not something you're going to experience regularly in your career with good reason. I hope you don't experience too many. My hair used to be a different color before I joined CrowdStrike, and then it kind of went the other way around with the incident response pieces. The major incident piece is something that you can do with this, and this is part of why it's helpful. This is part of how you maybe are able to sell it to management too. It's something that's kind of good for everybody. And as I said, there are some other benefits that aren't on this slide if you do it right. One of them is communication. Enough preaching, though. I'm going to get into the strategy part. So building this properly means that you're doing three things. You're figuring out what you're targeting, you're figuring out how you're doing it, and then you're figuring out what you want to get out of it. A lot of what we'll do is talk about what you want to get out of it first. I usually work backwards because I like looking at impact. So what are we going to break? Who are we going to tell about it? The outcome piece here includes leadership involvement. I'm going to start with that now because your sponsors, your executives, the people paying the bills for this should be more deeply involved than just they're paying the bills and they know it's happening. I've got a couple of points on that a little bit later, but we'll get into the meat of that. The main thing, though, is the goals. If you've got good goals, if this is properly structured, you're going to have a great exercise. You're going to have a wonderful time, except it's going to be extremely stressful and everyone's going to have a really hard time at some points. And you're going to get good outcomes and you're going to make it repeatable. It's an experiment at this point. It's a test you can do again and again and again, and that's sort of the point behind this. You don't do one, you do them yearly. You do them sometimes quarterly if you can. Smaller scale, build them out. The middle part, rules of engagement. There are some letters on here that maybe need definitions. I hate three-letter acronyms. I grew up in the Eastern Townships speaking both English and French, but as you've heard, my English kind of dominates my French right now. Thing is, when I hear three-letter acronyms, I still sometimes think of them in French, and it gets confusing. So how many people have seen a RACI chart before? That's a good number. I hate saying this, but I like seeing it. I hate RACI charts, but they're really useful. How many people have seen a Cairo chart before? Not the city, but the chart. Okay. So it's the same thing. It's just you have an omitted category on it. The reason you'd be using this in the rules of engagement and planning part is because there's certain people you don't want to include in the planning of the test, in the development of the test, or even sometimes in the testing. People are going to tell you, yeah, HR is off limits. Don't touch them. We don't want you seeing employee data. There's good reasons for that. On the other hand, maybe bringing HR in during the meetings and kind of discussion phases would be helpful. So RACI and Cairo charts, but specifically Cairo charts, are going to be helpful in building out your plan. Setting goals, figuring out who's included, and then finally, what you want to get out of this. Do you want something that's lasting? Do you want something you can actually take back and say, okay, here are a bunch of projects for all the rest of you to fix? Do you want a report that someone's going to sit on a shelf and not look at? I mean, I hate reporting, honestly, but I do love that a lot of the reports we get turned into projects. Years ago, probably a decade ago, so I can talk about it in a little more detail with a different employer, I went on site with a red team and we actually worked through this whole process of kind of figuring out where all the vulnerabilities were while we were talking to their executives, and we're going back and forth. And one of the red teamers is this really lovely guy. He runs a TV network at DEF CON. Great dude. Walks in and says, hey, so we just found something. I think you want to come see this. And there were 4 of us in the room. I think the chief security officer, the incident response director, me, and another consultant. We all walk over. He's like, is this supposed to be on this server? And the CISO says, no, but let me take a picture. So weeks go by. We go through a bunch of other stuff. They figure out how to sneak into a couple of room control systems. They're slinging viruses left, right, and center, like inert payloads. You know, if you've played capture the flag exercises, it was like one of those, except that these guys are a defense contractor. Meanwhile, we're wandering around finding plans for the secret submarine base for Dr. Evil. It was just amazing. We get out, we hand them the report, and they're like, yeah, but why do we care? So 3 pages in, as we're walking them through it, finally, the screenshot comes up, and one of the execs kind of goes, oh, well, that shouldn't be there. Followed by 3 other people going, yeah, that shouldn't be there. By the end of it, we'd not only justified the cost of the security program, but also probably saved someone's bank account and a couple of other things, including their FedRAMP program. And the thing with this is that you're not going to really get that if you're just coming in doing an assessment. And if your red team isn't the kind of red team that's actually enabled to talk to senior management, you're not going to get that. This is where the defenders come in, and this is where the outcomes come in. I would encourage you, if you're going to do a purple team test or even a red team test, get as much authorization and clearance as you can to break stuff. It's important. And once you've got all those other pieces in place, outcomes, action, plans, hopefully a lot of coffee, then you can get into the week of testing. Here's why I say a week. 2 things. One, I've seen these done shorter. Sometimes that's good if you're a smaller team, you've got a smaller footprint. Typically, a week's long enough for an incident response team to actually work through the escalation process of an incident in slow motion. In my experience, it's usually a day. We know that the average dwell time of most threat actors is 62 minutes, 2 minutes on the low side for the advanced ones. So that week is mostly going to be triage and recovery in most cases. If you're doing this with the red team, you can kind of tell them, okay, slow it down. We want to test every phase. We want to work through it. So usually the way we structure this, and I've seen this done with other consulting companies as well, Monday we're kind of getting in there doing initial access, lateral movement. Some of the other pieces that are kind of important, probably some logistics because somebody probably forgot to give someone an account. If your goals included get in from the outside, you might want to give yourself a little more time for that because that can be hard. If you're doing an assumed breach scenario, which honestly I would encourage because get in from the outside is going to prove that your firewalls are good and a bunch of other structural stuff that we've all been working on for literally 30 years should work correctly. Yeah, that's probably going to work. If you do an assumed breach scenario, that's a slightly different deal. That's something you're not going to have to deal with on a regular basis because, again, you've got that big incident that's escalating, and that's kind of what you want for a test like this. So let your red teamers in first. Let them skip the proof points and the mime casts of the world and just say, okay, we got an executive that got phished. We got a sysadmin that got phished. We see this all the time in incident response. You see this all the time if you're doing incident response and you're reading any newswire that's involved in this. And every time, one of us is probably going to shake their head and go, oh, how could that be possible? I hear from execs all the time the same thing. Like, oh, yeah, but that wouldn't happen. We've got a good security awareness training program. Yeah, okay, except it takes literally one person with access, and that's where the problem is. So start with an assumed breach scenario. This also makes it easy. If you want to structure something harder next year, go ahead. Build that timeout for your red teamers. But get them initial access for the first round. Get them in, let them do things that are impactful because trust me, it's going to have a bigger impact on the other end. I think the schedule said 1 week of absolute weirdness in the abstract. It is very weird. And the reason for that is Tuesday and Wednesday. So first day, everybody gets in. They're all kind of like, okay, this is great. You know, you've got the SOC team sitting with you. You've got the defenders. You've got whoever's handling the coach for the defense side. Then you've got your red team doing their capture the flag exercise effectively. And as you're going through it, you're going to start seeing, that's weird. Oh, that's weird. Oh, there's more weird stuff over there. There's a mindset in security. I used to do physical security as well. You train people to look for stuff that seems weird, but the problem with that is once you get your backup, everything seems weird. Like if you've been in a position where things feel threatening, I don't know if anyone's like wandered through certain parts of Montreal and felt, oh, this is weird. And you're in NDG. It's not that bad. If you feel things are threatening, you're going to see more threats. That's just kind of human nature. When we're doing this with defenders, that Tuesday, Wednesday period is frequently the everything is a threat week part. And the reason for it is red teamers are good at what they do. They're not going to do something you're going to notice the first time around unless you tell them to generate noise. So let's build that in. Let's build those reflexes in. Get people to investigate. Get them to work through it. This means that Wednesday is usually a busy day for everybody. And why that's good is because by Wednesday, you've kind of broken the ice with everybody. You want to talk to your red teamers? Well, they're going to be in these meetings. They're going to be talking. We're going to be working this out. Obviously, these things can go a lot longer, but typically by Thursday, Friday, you want to be at your testing goal period. What else you want to do besides just simulate an incident, who you want to talk to, and then how you're going to clean up. Cleanup's a pretty big piece as well. I'd say regardless of how long you're planning on doing this for, and if you're doing continuous threat, it's a different story. There are some very specific rules to play by, but we're going to get to that in a second. I want to start with a basic one. There are no wrong answers when you're working with a team of people who are supposed to be learning things. This is not supposed to be a test. It's supposed to be, well, an adventure, I guess. A very, very difficult one sometimes, but part of the reason I'm going back to the whole how many people have been in a major incident, if you're dealing with a major incident, you're going to see new and unusual stuff. The teams I work with on the DFIR side see this all the time. Like this is how we find the state threat actors. This is how we find all that weird stuff. Is that we have to be given the room to investigate, ask questions, and actually make mistakes. And I'm sure my employers would not like it if I said we make mistakes, except that that's actually normal human nature. Defenders make mistakes all the time. And practicing the recovery from error is almost as important as practicing how that error got there in the first place. So the goal of the week is to explore how advanced threat actors could work through your network. We're not talking about email breaches here. We're talking about something bigger. And if you set the structure and targets correctly, a lot of times the process is going to work out really well, and you're going to see things you weren't expecting. Some of that's going to be good. Some of that might be a reason to stop the exercise. Hopefully, this also ties into another piece. If you shouldn't be doing this if you don't have monitoring and detection tooling in place in the first place, that you know how it works already. So, if you're coming from an organization that has a spreadsheet and some logs, it's going to be a lot longer an exercise and you won't find as much. Your mileage may vary with that one, though. Going back to the rules. Well, there's a lot of incident bridge work in these. You can't run a red-blue exercise or a purple exercise without actually having people sit down and talk to each other. That usually means you're going to be working like you're on an incident bridge, which for some folks is the first time they've ever really had to deal with 8 hours of sitting on a phone line talking to people, unless you've been calling one of the telcos in this country. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to be mean. Or the help desk for a large computer software company. I could go on. Not everybody wants to spend 8 hours on a bridge. That's fine. If you're doing this with a large enough SOC team, rotate people in and out. Guess what you're now testing? You're testing your incident rotation process, your staffing process. And I think Vincent, who may be in the room, brought this up in the TTX exercise, get live people on the other end of the phone to play some of the roles that would be needed. Or even better, and I've done this with a couple of financial companies, bring people into the incident as they're becoming part of the incident, i.e. if help desk gets compromised, you bring the help desk person in and say, okay, now you're part of the gray cell for this. We're going to work through some of these other pieces. So you're gaining actors as you go. This is why I was saying get as much coverage as you can for the testing part and as much sponsorship. The deeper you go, the more like an incident this is going to be for the blue team, and the better they're going to be able to respond and understand what's going on. For the red team, the other side of this is great. If you're telling your red teamers, yeah, just go nuts. Here are your boundaries. That can be really, really helpful. So a couple of things here to probably pay attention to. I've already talked about the goal setting. Don't break stuff. This should be obvious. I have worked with red teams in the past where it wasn't quite as obvious as we'd like. I have a really good friend who did a lot of DoD contracting and has had a lot of don't break stuff scenarios that he managed to get, thankfully not break stuff, because that stuff was critical infrastructure. I've personally worked on stuff in terms of the medical side where, we want to get just far enough. And just far enough is, can I get a screenshot of your shell account in the Cayman Islands that should not be sitting on our server? That has nothing to do with the last thing I mentioned, by the way. The other reason don't break stuff as part of this is because if you break anything during one of these exercises, you're only doing the exercise once, and it's likely you're going to go find some other place to do these exercises afterwards. Really, we don't want to go that far. This is not a political activism statement. It's not dissent. The other piece is keep extensive notes. Here's why. I have worked on too many incidents in my life where the incident responders kind of go, oh yeah, we don't really know what's going on. You know, I'm like, all right, where are your notes? Where's your timeline? Where are your evidence artifacts, et cetera, et cetera. Red teamers also have to do this, and I know most of them do. Generally, the ones I've worked with have been super organized, and again, I've been doing this for a while. The notes are kind of useful as well for this last piece on the bottom right, clean up. If you know what you touched, if you know what was broken, if you know what got compromised and how it worked, that means on Friday when your cleanup is happening, it's only going to take 2 hours, and you can go out and get some beers instead of spending all Saturday cleaning up as well. I have unfortunately worked in places where there were artifacts left on these systems, and I'm just like, how did that get there? It's not a great look for anybody. It's not a good feeling either. The last one on the left side is communicate. I'm going to just keep re-emphasizing this, so keep communicating with everybody continuously. This is why this is actually weird and hard. I don't think most people get to talk to as many people as they would in an exercise like this during their daily life, unless they're at a conference like this one. Here's the problem, though. It's also not an adventure. People want results, so they're expecting tests. Meaningful tests mean that you're actually looking at things that you can fix, not things that you can't. Red teamers that I work with generally have a pretty good idea of how that's supposed to work. Some of the junior folks we'll bring in on the team will also usually be paying attention to this because it's something you gain with experience. So having someone help you set those goals, especially from the governance side, can be useful. They may not always know what that's going to look like from a technical perspective. That's fine. The bottom line of this, though, responders, security managers, they should be able to test out investigation and escalation techniques. This steps us outside the vulnerability piece and back into process. If I have to call the CISO because something's happening, let's stage that. Let's set that up. We don't need to tell the CISO that they're involved other than, yeah, you might get a phone call this week. If it's just a test, don't worry. But we're going to work through some things with you. When we do this, a lot of times, the awareness that comes from management and executives is actually kind of neat because they're like, oh, I get to have some fun? You're not going to take up 3 hours of my time with a sales pitch? Great, let's go. The other piece around this is testing for TTPs. And for those of you who have not heard the expression before, we're not talking about some sort of advanced toilet paper. It is tactics, techniques, and protocols. Again, another TLA. I hope you don't get too many of these today. Tracking these, keeping the notes and tracking the techniques and tactics that you've been using as a red teamer, very, very helpful. Sharing that with the blue team, very helpful. More pointedly, sharing that with management and executive and saying, okay, we know when someone does these things, this is possible right now. Here's your threat, here's your proof, here's the risks associated with that. Now let's fix it, and ideally quick before someone catches on. And that brings me to this. So our team frequently will end up using a shortened version of MITRE for a lot of this. The reason this table is up here is because the repeatability of testing is actually kind of important. If I can give you phases where we're going to test these things as a manager or as somebody controlling the purse strings or the governance side, that's going to be helpful. But more pointedly, if we can go back and repeat this again and again and again and check the changes in the results and see what the delta is over years, that's going to be extremely helpful. So this isn't something you can automate. You can't get AI to do this type of testing at the moment. I don't imagine we'll ever really get that quite to the point that we need to. And the reason for that is really simple. Threat actors are human beings. This is kind of like talking about economics being based on a rational consumer. There's no such thing. And as a result, you can't have a machine do some of this stuff. That's precisely why we still have red teams. Otherwise, it'll all be vulnerability management. So a couple of pieces here. When you're reporting or when you're kind of covering this, you want to literally go down into those objective pieces and talk about what happened underneath those. So it's a series of columns. I haven't put it up because I can't really give you a good example of this in this scenario. But if you come talk to me afterwards, we can talk about it. There's something to kind of just be aware of here. And there's kind of a factor that we see a lot with purple team exercises is scorekeeping. So we've got our defenders on one side, our attackers on the other. It's red versus blue. The detections are going to be part of the score, the responses, the coverage, the red teamers going, I hit this, 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 and this. That can be really fun. It can be super gamified. It's worth being careful about that in terms of escalating it, but I've seen that be kind of great because then you've got this little friendly competition going on. Where it can get problematic is if you bring this to people who don't understand how it's working and they get lost. And that leads me to some failure scenarios. I'm going to start with the fifth. No detections. Well, we have a lot of questions. Stop the test. Like, back up. Let's figure this out again. Why aren't we seeing anything? What's misconfigured? What's going on? I've worked through a couple of scenarios like this. If we're getting no detections by midweek, like if there's nothing happening, we're usually going to be like, okay, well, you're probably wasting your money doing this then. The other one is one big bad one. This is not a scenario that anyone likes seeing, but again, that Tuesday, Wednesday syndrome, everything looks like a threat. Well, it turns out maybe you found a long dwell threat actor in your system while you were doing this test. Also, stop the damn test at that point. It's not worth continuing. You have some other things. This isn't a red team, blue team exercise. It's an incident now. The rest of these are also going to turn into incidents if you're not careful. Critical systems. I said this, don't break stuff. Infrastructure. This is a really big one. I've accidentally compromised infrastructure doing testing once or twice in my life. It's not a good look. It feels bad. Thankfully, I didn't get fired for it. I was in my 20s. Long story short, we discovered some vulnerabilities in the infrastructure because I hit the wrong button and everything just kind of went, and that was that. No, you don't want to be in that situation as a tester. It's even worse as a defender because then you're going to start going, okay, well, how'd that happen and what did we miss? And the truth is it's outside of scope. Access controls. This one happens constantly. We're going in, we're doing an assumed breach, which means we've got an account we've compromised. We maybe have more than one. Usually there are 3 or 4. Lateral movement is a thing. It's very helpful. Those access controls can actually turn into a situation where a bunch of employees are not able to go to work that day because HR is investigating. So this goes back to the communication part I just mentioned. And then the last piece is data exposure. I can't emphasize this enough. As red teamers, you probably shouldn't be looking at data. As blue teamers, you probably shouldn't be looking at PII if you can avoid it. The probably part also comes into all of the coverage you've got from your legal and everybody else. Just be careful about this. We don't need more stuff being exposed on the internet. We've already got enough of it. It's a huge problem. And it really ruins people's lives. So yeah, we avoid that as much as possible. This goes back to setting those goals correctly. You don't want to cross the line into reading employee records or somebody's emails. I'm going to move over to outcomes. And this talk is going kind of quick, so hopefully you won't all fall asleep, but you know. Outcomes are pretty simple. So as I mentioned, we have a weekly schedule when we run these. This is kind of what I encourage as a practice, partially because you can do daily end of day briefings. And there's some things I want to talk about that kind of at the end of this. You can also do weekly end of week briefings. You want both. And ideally, you want all the people you can get in those briefings who are actually involved in the process of doing security. That includes management and leadership, governance, legal. You want them in there for those briefings, and you want to be able to explain it to them quickly. So let's not get into how AD was compromised. Let's say we did this, 3 points, that's it, talk to an executive. List of TTPs, list of detections, what the red team did, what the blue team saw them doing, what was missed. 3 key things for the end of day briefing, and the reason they're key is because what was missed means that you can fix it for tomorrow. So when you come back, you can look for that a little more. If you've done CTFs, some of you probably have done pros versus Joes. That's actually part of what they talk about in the hot wash. There's a good reason for this. That's a really quick way to get some quick improvements. It's going to work nicely. Weekly, this is a bigger story. We occasionally do the scorecards that I was talking about. We don't always. And the reason for it is in some situations, it's not expedient to say, yeah, you missed 30 things and caught 5. There were 5 important things, and that's what counts. But detections, misses, and activities usually will show up on those reports. Major findings. Your AD is misconfigured. Occurs all the time. SMB is open on all these ports. That's great. But again, we want to do this with people who may not necessarily understand what those 3 letters mean. So yeah, I used Windows File Share to kind of pivot into another computer, and that other computer was the server that runs all your applications. And from there, I could have done these 4 things, but didn't. I promise you there are going to be people in the room who don't pay attention to security who go, wait, what? And that's actually what you want. The last piece is just process and what worked and what didn't. The process is the escalation. We called Cheryl from accounting, sorry, Cheryl, and she said it wasn't her account. We actually did a little bit of an investigation. Talking about that's actually really helpful because it gives the rest of the team a sense of how it worked. It gives your leadership a sense of what you actually have to do in a day. And it also gives some of the folks on the stakeholder side, like HR and legal, a sense of what they need to be prepared for if something like this happens. That's going to be critical if you have a real incident. It's also a lot of fun in these situations because they come in not knowing what to expect the first time around, and usually they're pretty blown away. The last piece is the after action. That sometimes takes a couple of weeks. It could be longer. You want to report. You want projects coming out of this. You don't want to just have testing that occurs in a vacuum. Testing that occurs in a vacuum is, actually, I can't say that on stage with this logo down there, but you can guess where I'm going with this. Testing that occurs in a vacuum is basically shouting into the void, or pick some other thing that you like as a metaphor. Vulnerability remediation is probably one of the biggest things that comes out of these things. It's also one of the things that I see frequently in repeat tests and repeat other exercises that I do that doesn't get fixed. Somebody will come back and say, we can't afford it, we can't do this, so test again. And if this keeps showing up, you already have something to talk about with the leadership who's coming into these meetings. Process improvement, I like this one. Getting good at doing incident response is tricky, especially when you don't constantly do incident response. Knowing what you're doing is something that comes with seat time. Cutting down the stress and anxiety is also something that comes with seat time, and it's all kind of important. And the last piece is the repeatable functions. I'm mentioning this as the last piece because you're going to want to do this again. You're going to want other tests that spring out of this. So you're building basically a testing matrix from having your red team and your blue team in a room just beating the crap out of your network and all the systems on it. And you're going to get good results from that, provided that you've actually approached it carefully. I could go into the list of people and processes and technology we'd be looking at. I've got them right up here on my notes. The main one that I often see that's actually interesting is DLP. So we get clients who come in and say, yeah, we want to test to see if we can exfiltrate. I can give you a number of successful exfiltrations because it's actually a little funny. Can anyone guess, actually? Just wild guess. Is it over 50? Yeah. No, not specifics. Just a percentage. 50% or more is successful for all the red teaming and blue teaming. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's 100. It's always 100. They're always going to get to a point where they can figure out how to get it out without you seeing. NetFlow is helpful for that. There's lots of other stuff, but sometimes your SOC's not aware of that. We don't know where to pull that information in from. Great. Well, now we've got more findings. The fun part about this is when you have to explain how someone leaked the super secret submarine base plans over DNS to your CFO who doesn't understand what DNS is, let alone that isn't even aware that there was a super secret submarine base, because, yeah. It's fun times all around. And this leads me to the last piece, kind of. Who else should see the report? I have a list here. I'm going to let you read some of them. I'm also going to talk over some of this for a couple of reasons. I've mentioned leadership again and again and again. Look, I've worked in security long enough to know that frequently security teams are kind of treated like janitors. They're only really important when there's a mess to clean up, and the rest of the time, everyone just expects things to function as normal. I work in a company that builds and sells security products right now, so obviously we take it a little more seriously, but in my past life, it's been a lot of like, yeah, this is a not even tertiary, but a cinquentiary part of the budget. We're going to improve security by giving you $500 so that you can go investigate an MFA solution on 3 computers. Ian mentioned this in his keynote speech, like there's a lot of stuff that people do where they're kind of focused on either the big shiny object that's, oh no, we got to look out for AI, we got to look out for deepfakes. Yeah, you do, but you also have to look out for all this other stuff that you haven't even gotten to yet. So leadership, get them in there. Talk to them like they're human beings. If you can take a page out of the Greenpeace book where they're like, yeah, we have to talk about the environment, but not in a way that's going to scare people, that's a good start. Defenders. Yeah, that's obvious. But the thing is, bring all the defenders in, not just the people who are in the activity. And some people are going to be missing parts of that. I had a case a few years back where we ran a red-blue exercise, a tabletop exercise, and then a couple of weeks later, the client for this organization got compromised using a really similar tactic to the one that we actually emulated in both of those exercises. We ran them back to back. And what was funny was, like, because they had brought everyone in, they're like, yeah, okay, we know what to do with this. We know how this, oh, they probably got in this way. So the incident was over within 48 hours. Most of the resolution happened quickly. And again, this is a super awesome success case. This is not going to happen all the time, but it was really cool to see, because when we came back on site with them, we were like, so what happened? And they were like, oh, well, the thing we did 3 weeks ago that was really scary and stressful and everyone got in fights over. I'm like, yeah. So the bad guys did this too. I'm like, oh, and did you die? No, it worked out well. partially because we could sit through for an hour and just talk about what happened and figure out what to do next. And then they got to apply it in real time, which is not something you'd always want to do, but hey, cool. System owners, I'm talking about business owners here. I'm talking about applications. I'm talking about people who go, oh God, I don't want to do that. We can't bring this down. Mainframes. Go bust up a mainframe. Trust me, you'll be in a special niche as a red teamer at that point. But beyond that, non-IT system owners don't usually have a very good idea of what's going on with security. And when they do, that's great. But the more they know, the better it's going to be for you as you're securing these systems. The last piece was legal governance in HR. I've been beating on this one. I'll talk, but you know, having the teams that are actually handling the crisis response aspect of an incident, because all incidents eventually will become a crisis unless you deal with them very quickly, those people are very good to have in the room. They're also going to be the people that are actually going to say things like, hey, this should have been underprivileged, which not a great thing to hear, but it's good to know about that. I guess my last piece, and I'm going to wrap this up here, is this is a very emerging part of testing at this point. As much as we've been talking about purple teaming forever, there have been people doing it for ages. As a structured testing process, a lot of this stuff is still in a state where we haven't turned it into something as structured as software QA, or for that matter, some of the other systematic things that come out of that discipline of engineering. So there's a lot we can do. And for all of you, I guess there's, the one final point of this is you're all very creative people. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Typically, I don't know anyone in cybersecurity who doesn't have a lot of creativity in them. What else can you add? Because this is actually a fairly open structure at the moment, and there's a lot you can do with it that could be helpful. So it's worth considering. I know on my end, I've talked about working with disaster recovery teams and sort of a lot of manufacturing and kind of mining and that sort of thing where things go boom. Those can be kind of interesting scenarios if you can actually set them up correctly. You can make this as big as you want if you've got the budget and the support, but you're only going to get that by building it out. And that's it. That's the end of my talk. Hopefully it wasn't too much, but if you all want to come ask me questions, I'll be over at the CrowdStrike booth. I'll be outside. I'll probably be here for a couple more minutes because we still have the room. But I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I really appreciate the time.